Hello everybody, I'm Albert, and I'm a researcher studying bird fossils and evolution, which is not what this video is about. Instead, here I'll be reviewing all the movies in the Japanese media franchise Doraemon. Hardly anyone, it seems, talks about Doraemon in the English-speaking world. In some ways, it's understandable why this would be the case. If you're someone living in the core Anglosphere, so the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, or New Zealand, it wouldn't be unusual for you to live your entire life without ever having heard of Doraemon. If you live in Japan, on the other hand, it would probably be almost impossible for you to not be aware of this franchise. The character Doraemon, who is pictured here, is a cultural icon there on par with, say, Mickey Mouse in the United States, and the franchise is a media giant that is still very much going strong, with new episodes of the Doraemon anime airing every week, and a new theatrical movie every year. There is even a museum dedicated to the creator of Doraemon, and stores that specialize in selling Doraemon merchandise, with new officially licensed products being released multiple times a month. And it's not just in Japan that Doraemon is incredibly popular, it's almost as well known in most other parts of East Asia. I spent part of my childhood in Taiwan, and you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't recognize Doraemon there. It is reportedly also popular in India, parts of Southeast Asia, Latin America, and continental Europe. In fact, when I visited Spain earlier this year, I noticed that Doraemon was playing on the television 3 times a day. From that perspective, it kind of stands out that discussion about Doraemon is so lacking in the Anglosphere. As someone who watches animated series and movies on a semi-regular basis, I occasionally check out the work of reviewers who focus on animated media, but even those who go out of their way to discuss obscure foreign works never seem to give Doraemon a look. Sure, the franchise is primarily targeted towards children, albeit with a substantial adult following, but the same is true of many other works that these reviewers tend to cover. And Doraemon contains several themes that a lot of reviewers would probably enjoy analyzing, such as storytelling techniques in episodic series, commentary on societal issues, and incorporation of science and culture into popular media. Even without considering the manga and TV series, there are over 40 movies in the Doraemon franchise to date, so there certainly isn't a lack of content to talk about. All of that is a very long way of saying that, well, if no one else is going to discuss Doraemon, fine, I'll do it myself. So just to briefly introduce what Doraemon is about, the franchise is named after the character Doraemon, who is a robotic cat from the future, specifically the 22nd century. On his belly, he carries a pocket that leads to its own literal pocket dimension, in which he can store a multitude of futuristic gadgets. Many Doraemon gadgets appear in one chapter or episode of the series and are never brought up again, but there are a few recurring items that are iconic to the franchise. One of these is a little propeller hat that allows a user to fly, which I'm used to calling the bamboo copter because it's based on a real-life Asian toy of the same name, but official English translations call it the hopter, which I think sounds kind of silly to be honest, and the original Japanese name is takekopta. Then there's this big pink doorway called the Anywhere Door, which can create a portal to anywhere that the user wants to go within 10 light years. Doraemon also has a time machine, which is depicted as a somewhat flying carpet-like vehicle with a lamppost on top, and that is how he's able to travel between different time periods. Now, even though Doraemon is the title character, he is not the focal character in most of the stories. Instead, that role goes to a boy named Nobita, who is extremely unlucky, does terribly at school, and constantly gets picked on. This unfortunate streak will apparently continue into his adulthood, to the point where his great-great-grandchild will live a terrible life as a result. So Nobita's descendants sent Doraemon back in time to our present, so he can try to turn Nobita's life around and hopefully change her future for the better. Nobita has a few friends at school who round out the main cast. Other than Doraemon, Nobita's best friend is Shizuka, a kind, smart girl who he has a crush on. Then there are these 2 other boys, although calling them Nobita's friends is somewhat generous because they're also his main bullies. One of them is Wan-Nyan, which is actually a nickname. His real name is Kachi, who often forces the other kids to do what he wants. And the other is Suneo, who comes from a wealthy family. He tends to bully Nobita in more underhanded ways, like bragging about his possessions and family vacations, and then refusing to let Nobita participate in whatever next cool thing he has planned. It's honestly quite curious that these friends all hang out on a regular basis, considering that Giant and Suneo can be very mean to the others, and Nobita, sad to say, can be very creepy towards Shizuka at times. On multiple occasions while reading the manga, I've wondered, why are these characters even friends? That being said, the movies tend to put more emphasis on their positive traits, so their dynamic in the movies comes across more as a group of friends who annoy and tease each other, but will help each other in times of need. In any case, many Doraemon stories revolve around Nobita begging Doraemon for a gadget, so he can either impress Shizuka or get even with Giant and Suneo. However, Nobita often succumbs to the temptation of misusing the gadget for his own ends, and then receives some comeuppance as a result. Doraemon has spawned all kinds of media over the years, from video games to educational books to novels. However, the core of the franchise is the manga and anime series. The manga was created by the very prolific manga artist Fujiko F. Fujio, and it ran in Japanese children's magazines from 1969 up until Fujio's death in 1996. During and since this time, the stories in the manga have been collected into print books that can still be purchased from Japanese booksellers. The first attempt at adapting Doraemon into an anime was a short-lived series in 1973, but wasn't very popular, and is pretty much not acknowledged by official sources nowadays. A more successful anime series started airing in 1979, and this one lasted for over 20 years, ending in 2005. This was the Doraemon anime that I watched growing up. In 2005, the Doraemon anime was rebooted with a new art style and voice actors, and this series continues to this day. Since 1980, so shortly after the start of the 1979 series, the Doraemon anime has also released cinematic movies on an almost yearly basis. As of the time of recording in the year 2023, there are 44 Doraemon movies in total, and it is these movies that I'll be focusing on for most of the rest of this video. Up until Fujiko F. Fujio's death in 1996, the majority of Doraemon movies are based directly on stories that he wrote for the manga. After his passing, the movies have often taken inspiration from the manga, but their overarching plots tend to consist of newly written content. Starting with the 2005 anime reboot, the franchise has also released remakes of some of its older movies on multiple occasions, often changing up not only the art style but also story elements from the originals. I have no doubt that probably the primary reason Doraemon gets so little attention in the Anglosphere is that a lot of this media is not widely available in English. However, official English translations of some Doraemon media do exist. In fact, most of the manga has been translated in English, but the trick is that most of these translated chapters have only been released on Kindle, and only in the United States and Canada at that. There are also short-lived English dubs for small portions of the 2005 anime series. One version aired in the USA between 2014 to 2015, and a different dub aired in the UK between 2015 and 2016. Neither of these have been released on home media or streaming services, but the entirety of the US dub and parts of the UK dub have been archived online, so they're out there. Interestingly, these were not the first attempts at dubbing Doraemon into English. If you'd like to learn more about that history, there is an informative series of videos on YouTube by Yui Haruhara, which I'll be linking to in the description below. Most of the Doraemon movies, on the other hand, have not gotten a widespread English release, so if you're an English speaker who doesn't understand Japanese, or any of the other languages that Doraemon is widely available in, you'll probably have to look for fan-made subtitles, which do exist in varying quality. I will not be giving advice on where to find unofficial English subtitles for Doraemon movies in this video. If you're watching this, you are most likely a denizen of the internet, and pretty good at finding things. For the rest of this video, I will be giving my thoughts on all the Doraemon movies that have been released as of 2023. Obviously, these reviews will be brief for reasons of practicality, and I will try to keep spoilers minimal or vague. If you're interested in my more spoilery thoughts on these movies, I have written more detailed text reviews on my Tumblr blog, which I will link to in the description below. I will be covering these movies in the order that they came out in, with the exception of the movie remakes. For the remakes, I'll discuss them directly after I review the original versions of those movies, so they can be compared back to back with one another. For each movie, I will assign a star rating out of 10. This rating will be relative to the other movies in the franchise, so if I give a 10-star rating to a movie, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's one of the best movies I've ever seen, but that is one of my favorite movies in the Doraemon franchise. Conversely, a 1-star rating does not necessarily mean it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen, but that it's one of my least favorite Doraemon movies. I'll also give each movie a ranking from 1 to 43, with first place being the highest ranked and 43rd being the lowest. And you might be thinking, wait, you just said there were 44 movies, and the explanation there is that I've disqualified one of the movies from the ranking for reasons that I'll get to. Finally, after reviewing all the movies individually, I will go over which Doraemon movies I most highly recommend at the end of the video. So, without further ado, let's begin. The first movie in the Doraemon franchise was 1980's Nobita's Dinosaur. The premise of this movie is that Nobita uses one of Doraemon's gadgets to revive the fossilized egg of an extinct marine reptile, a plesiosaur, and he keeps the hatchling as a pet. As a paleontologist, I am obligated to point out that plesiosaurs were not dinosaurs. Also, they probably spent their entire lives in water and didn't lay eggs, though that was something we didn't know at the time that this movie was made. Looking at this poster, what strikes me is that you can barely tell that this movie has anything to do with prehistory. There's a pterosaur on the poster, but that's about it. Nobita's plesiosaur doesn't even appear on here. It seems that they were really marketing this as a Doraemon movie first and foremost. I think a lot of people who grew up with Doraemon would name this one of their favorite Doraemon movies. It's certainly very nostalgic, and the story is well known among Doraemon fans. However, I tend to think it's decent. The plot, for example, is very straightforward. Except for maybe the time travel element, Nobita's Dinosaur basically hits the same notes as every other story where the main focus is a child taking care of a pet. As far as that goes, I don't have any major complaints about this movie, but it also reads as a relatively safe first attempt at a Doraemon film, so I think giving it 6 out of 10 stars is fair. I put it at 17th place in my Doraemon movie ranking, slightly above the halfway point. A reasonable first entry in the Doraemon cinematic lineup, but not the most interesting or exciting installment that the franchise has to offer. Nobita's Dinosaur was remade in 2006, and this remake was the first film to come out of the 2005 anime reboot. The biggest changes from the original concern the art style. The 2006 version is probably one of the most visually interesting Doraemon movies, playing a lot with exaggeration and stylization. There are also some minor alterations to the story, which for most part I liked. However, the overall narrative remains more or less the same. If you could only watch one version of Nobita's Dinosaur, I think either the original or the remake are fine to view on their own. However, given that I find the story relatively unremarkable to begin with, I think the original has a context of historical novelty going for it, being the first Doraemon film ever made. Therefore, I give the remake the same star rating, 6 out of 10, and I rank it just below the original, at 18th place. The second Doraemon movie to be released was 1981's The Records of Nobita, Spaceblazer. In this movie, Nobita and Doraemon meet the pioneering settlers of a distant planet, and protect them from an evil corporation that wants to mine the planet's resources. This story takes many cues from the space western genre. It's quite a strange Doraemon movie, because Nobita's classmates, Shizuka, Giant, and Suneo, are not in it as much. They do appear and have a role to play, but much more emphasis is placed on Nobita and Doraemon bonding with new characters exclusive to the movie. I know that some other Doraemon fans really enjoy this aspect of the film, but to me one of the most interesting elements of the Doraemon franchise is the dynamic among the main characters, so it's not quite my cup of tea. Otherwise, this movie doesn't stand out to me all that much, so I give it a rating of 4 out of 10 stars, and rank it in 27th place. A remake of this film called The New Record of Nobita Spaceblazer came out in 2009. This remake does make some substantial changes to the story. Unfortunately, most of these changes fell flat for me. For example, an entirely new character was added to the movie, and they go through their own subplot that ends up being critical to resolving the main conflict, but they're otherwise not very well integrated into the storyline. So even though I'm not crazy about the 1981 version, I still recommend it strongly over the remake version. The remake gets a rating of 2 stars from me and a ranking at 36th place. Next, we have Nobita and the Haunts of Evil from 1982. In this one, Nobita and his friends explore Central Africa in search of land uncharted by humans. This movie has a very ominous sounding title, and based on my limited understanding of Japanese, Haunts of Evil is not exactly inaccurate, but in the context of the story, the intended meaning is probably closer to unexplored realm. That being said, this is one of the darker Doraemon films, with multiple instances where one or more of the main characters come close to dying. It also contains various fun elements that will be recurring features of future Doraemon films, like the main characters using Doraemon's gadgets to live and travel comfortably in the wilderness. I consider this a pretty solid adventure story, but there is something that I think audiences should be made aware of before they watch it. There's a scene in this movie that features indigenous African people, who are depicted with, shall we say, highly caricatured character designs. Because this is an issue that cannot really be encapsulated by giving the film a numerical rating relative to the others, I am disqualifying this movie from my rating system here. The good news is that you don't need to watch the original Nobita and the Haunts of Evil to get a taste of the story, because it was remade in 2014 under the title New Nobita's Great Demon, again with the ominous titles. Now, I cannot speak to the cultural depiction of the indigenous people in this remake, but the character designs are substantially improved, as one should expect from a movie made in the 2010s. On the whole, I think this is a competent remake that keeps most of what made the original movie good. The main changes involve expanding on some parts of the plot, which it manages to do in a mostly unobtrusive way. I rate this remake pretty highly, with 9 out of 10 stars, and an overall ranking of 4th place. If the movie sounds interesting to you, I'd obviously recommend watching this version over the original. 1983's Doraemon movie was Nobita and the Castle of the Undersea Devil, which is currently the oldest Doraemon movie that has not yet received a remake. The story here is that Nobita and his friends go on a camping trip at the bottom of the ocean. This one is weird. The first 2/3 feel a bit like a watered-down episode of the Magic School Bus, with the main characters touring the ocean floor in a futuristic vehicle. Throughout the movie, there are hints of something bigger going on, but the protagonists don't really get involved with the main conflict until there's only about half an hour left in the movie, and then when they do, things escalate very quickly. Honestly, I think this movie might be worth watching just for how strange it is. Now, I can see the first half of the movie being potentially a bit boring to some viewers, though to me the character interactions and the Undersea theme are enough to keep it interesting, especially considering how little we knew about the deep sea in the 1980s. In terms of overall quality, I give this movie 6 out of 10 stars, and rank it in 19th place. The next one is Nobita's Great Adventure into the Underworld from 1984, which features Nobita using one of Doraemon's gadgets to create a parallel universe where magic exists. This leads to them having to fight actual demons. Out of the Doraemon films I saw when I was little, this was one of my favorites, and I think it still holds up very well. It's one of the most thrilling adventures in the series, with an eerie mystery set up in the beginning of the story, and even a couple potentially surprising twists and turns in the plot. It's safe to say that this is still one of my favorite Doraemon movies, so 10 out of 10, with a ranking in 2nd place. This movie was remade in 2007 as Nobita's New Great Adventure into the Underworld. There are major alterations to the story in this version, some of which I find satisfying, but others I'm not a fan of. In fact, I think it's ironic that this movie is still titled The Great Adventure into the Underworld, because it actually removed some of the most adventure-focused parts of the original story. If I had to consider this remake by itself, I probably wouldn't think it terrible, but it really falls far short of the original film in my opinion. Something else that leads me to dock points off the remake is the way that it treats Shizuka. One element of classic Doraemon that hasn't exactly aged well is the way Shizuka is regularly subjected to some really perverted jokes, which is especially off-putting considering that she's meant to be 10 years old. Most infamously, there's a running gag in the series where her male friends walk in on her while she's bathing, unintentionally or otherwise. In similar vein, the original Nobita's Great Adventure into the Underworld, despite all the good qualities I mentioned earlier, had a joke in which Nobita's magic only works when it's to look under her skirt. Now, one might expect a modern remake to remove this or at least tone it down, but instead, the remake not only increases the number of times that this happens, but even shows the other boys, including Doraemon, who, keep in mind, is supposed to be a babysitting robot, eagerly watching when it does. So, 2 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking of 39th place. If you had to pick one version of this story to watch, my vote is obviously for the original. Next up is Nobita's Little Star Wars from 1985, which is sometimes translated as Nobita's Little Space Wars. Nobita and his friends meet some tiny aliens and help them overthrow a dictatorship. Even though the premise of this movie didn't immediately grab me, I actually like it quite a lot. The villains in this movie are surprisingly threatening, and the story puts a large amount of focus on Shizuka and especially Suneo, who often get the short end of the stick in the Doraemon movies. The two of them even share several scenes together, which is a dynamic that we rarely see among the main characters. To me, the main flaw of this movie is that if you're familiar with the Doraemon franchise, you'll probably notice that the main source of tension hangs by a relatively weak thread that is never really addressed. However, if one is willing to look past this apparent oversight, I think there's more to like about this movie than not. So I give it a 9 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 6th place. Nobita's Little Star Wars received a recent remake, which was originally meant to be released in 2021, but was then delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and pushed back to 2022. That is why it's confusingly titled Nobita's Little Star Wars 2021. There are some changes in this remake that I feel lukewarm about, but for most part I think it does a good job of capitalizing on and even fleshing out the strengths of the original. If I had to pick between the two of them, it would be a very close call, but the remake might actually come out just ahead, so it also gets 9 out of 10 from me, and a ranking in 5th place. Now, we get to Nobita and the Steel Troops from 1986. In this one, Nobita and his friends have to defend humanity from an army of alien robots. It is widely remembered as one of the most emotional Doraemon movies, and the way I see it, that reputation is well deserved. It's difficult to talk about the plot in detail without getting into spoiler territory, but I will say that, though there are a few logical contrivances and inconsistencies in this story, it is a very strong entry in the Doraemon franchise, so I'm happy to give it 9 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 8th place. With this being one of the oldest and most popular Doraemon movies, it's not surprising that it eventually received a remake in the reboot series, titled Nobita and the New Steel Troops, which was released in 2011. From what I've seen, this one is one of the most highly acclaimed Doraemon movies, especially among Doraemon fans who grew up with the current 2005 series. So what I'm about to say is probably going to be one of my most unpopular Doraemon movie opinions. I can see why this movie is so popular, because it does try very hard to recapture the strong emotions of the original. However, in my opinion, this comes at the expense of many other elements that made the original movie so effective, and even raises additional questions that are unique to this adaptation. One of the most compelling things to me about the original Nobita and the Steel Troops was not just the emotional payoff at the end, but also the sense of danger and tension that the protagonists go through while trying to protect the Earth. And I feel like a lot of that tension is lost in the remake. This is another Doraemon remake that I might think more highly of if I could consider it in isolation. But with the original compare it to, I'm rating it no higher than 4 stars and ranking it in 32nd place. That being said, I'm well aware that I'm kind of going against the grain here, so this might be a case where I'd suggest watching both versions and deciding which you prefer for yourself. 1987 gave us Nobita and the Knights on Dinosaurs, in which Nobita and his friends discover a civilization of dinosaurs hidden underground. The scientific basis of this movie is very interesting to me, because it was directly inspired by a specific thought experiment proposed by the paleontologist Dale Russell in the 1980s. He speculated about the possibility that certain dinosaurs might have evolved human-like intelligence if the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period hadn't happened. The story here also incorporates a few hypotheses in the Earth sciences that were relatively recent at the time, and I think the plot revelations towards the end of the movie are decently executed. However, I don't find the rest of this film quite as entertaining as its premise would suggest, with the build-up to the main conflict being pretty dull in my opinion. I give it a rating of 4 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 30th place. A fascinating film from a meta perspective, but not the most engaging. The next entry is The Record of Nobita's Parallel Visit to the West from 1988. This one bears a distinction of being the only Doraemon movie released in Fujiko F. Fujio's lifetime that did not have an original manga counterpart. The premise is fun, as it features Nobita and his friends reenacting the 16th century Chinese novel Journey to the West. By the way, if you're not familiar with Journey to the West, it is the subject of a very entertaining recap series by the YouTube channel Overly Sarcastic Productions. Unfortunately, this is another movie that I think doesn't live up to its full potential. It has its moments, especially once the main characters settle into their roles, but a good chunk of the movie is spent on setup that I find relatively uninteresting. This one also gets 4 out of 10 from me, and a ranking in 31st place. Now we reach Nobita and the Birth of Japan, released in 1989. In this movie, Nobita and his friends all want to run away from home. So they run away to the Pleistocene epoch, 70,000 years ago, before humans lived in Japan. Right away, this is a very promising start. It's a narrative hook that tells us a little bit about each main character, and the idea of the kids learning about the earliest humans in Japan, as a result of running away from home, is very creative. However, the ending is where this film drops the ball for me. I can't go into detail without giving away spoilers, but I've always found that this movie resolves in a very disappointing and unsatisfactory way. This is another 4 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in 28th place. Nobita and the Birth of Japan was remade in 2016, and I'll cut to the chase, I'm very happy with this one. It keeps pretty much everything about the original movie that made it interesting, but completely overhauls the ending in a way that fixes my biggest problem with the original. Not only that, but also adds more emotional and narrative resonance to the story's conclusion, providing a sense of closure that a lot of Doraemon movies, including the original version of Nobita and the Birth of Japan, don't really have. There might be individual elements of other movies that I enjoy more, but I can't think of any other Doraemon film that I find quite as well-rounded as this one, and for that I give the 2016 remake of Nobita and the Birth of Japan the full 10 out of 10 stars, and the top spot in my current ranking. My friend Joan and I actually did an in-depth review of this movie on our podcast, Through Time and Clades, which I will be linking in the description, and Joan had never seen or read any Doraemon media prior to this, so if you'd like to get a first-time viewer's perspective on Doraemon, you might be interested in checking that out. In addition to sharing our thoughts on Nobita and the Birth of Japan 2016 as a movie, we also do a deep dive into how well the film portrays the animals and environments of Pleistocene Japan, based on current scientific understanding. Okay, we've reached the 1990s, and coming up is Nobita and the Animal Planet. In this one, Nobita sleepwalks to another planet, yeah really, where he and his friends meet a civilization of anthropomorphic animals. This is essentially Doraemon's take on an environmentalist movie, and my thoughts on it are basically, it's alright. It has little in the way of what I consider major flaws, but it also doesn't do much that feels fresh for either the genre or the Doraemon franchise. If you grew up in the 90s paying attention to environmental issues like I did, you've probably seen some variation on this movie's story before, so 5 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 26th place feels about right here. 1991 brings us to Nobita's Dorabian Nights, in which Shizuka gets literally lost inside an Arabian Nights story, and Nobita and the others have to rescue her. I don't particularly like this one. Shizuka being relegated to a stereotypical damsel in distress role is already not a winning premise for me, but on top of that it takes some serious leaps in logic for the plot to work. As just one example, Shizuka gets trapped inside the story from a physical book, but the others can't go inside the book themselves because it gets burned into fire. So Doraemon suggests that because Arabian Nights has character inspired by real-world figures, it's possible that they'll be able to find Shizuka if they travel to 8th century Baghdad by time machine. This sounds like a ridiculous stretch, but it somehow works, and they don't consider time traveling to before the book was destroyed and retrieving the actual book. The chain of contrivances it takes to move the story forward continues to snowball from there, so I give this movie 3 out of 10, and a ranking in 38th place. In contrast, the next movie is actually one of my favorites. It's 1992's Nobita and the Kingdom of Clouds. Here, Nobita and his friends build their own kingdom in the clouds, only to find a hidden civilization in the sky. This one is very interesting. At its core, it's another 90s environmentalist movie, but the central conflict is relatively nuanced for a children's film of that genre, certainly more so than the one in Nobita and the Animal Planet. This movie is also unusual in that it contains multiple plot-relevant references to the main Doraemon TV series, although enough context is provided that one can probably still appreciate this without having seen the relevant episodes. As a bonus for me, Nobita and the Kingdom of Clouds features prominent appearances from extinct animals, including some pretty obscure species. I think the biggest flaw of the movie is that it's so jam-packed with interesting material that some of it comes up with little to no chance of explanation. Even so, I like this film enough to give it 10 out of 10, and third place in my ranking of Doraemon movies. Nobita and the Tin Labyrinth from 1993 is another interesting one. Nobita and his friends visit a strange, yet luxurious hotel, but end up having to stop a robot uprising. Now, I don't really love the lead-up to the main plot here, because I think it makes the movie-exclusive characters that the protagonists meet seem unsympathetic, but the overall narrative is quite engaging, and it really underscores the importance of Doraemon himself in terms of his role in the story. So I give this one 7 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 16th place. Up next is Nobita's Three Visionary Swordsmen from 1994. The basic gist of this one is that Nobita and his friends play a fantasy role-playing game in their dreams. I think this movie is quite fun to watch, and it certainly has one of the darkest and most gripping adventures in the Doraemon film series. However, you're likely to end up with a bunch of unanswered questions if you start thinking about exactly how the dream world interacts with reality in this story. On the other hand, maybe that kind of surrealism is exactly what you should expect from a plot like this. In any case, I enjoy this film enough to give it 9 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 7th place. Nobita's Diary on the Creation of the World from 1995. Nobita and his friends create their own universe for a school project, learning about the history of the Earth and humanity along the way. In some ways, this may be the most unusual Doraemon film of all, because it's mostly a series of vignettes, with the main characters observing and occasionally interfering with what happens. Although I probably wouldn't want every Doraemon movie to follow this format, I like what they did here, and the history of the world theme obviously appeals to me. I can see how this movie might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely worth a look in my book. It gets 8 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in 9th place. Coming up next is Nobita and the Galaxy Super Express from 1996. In this one, Nobita and his friends take a train ride across the Milky Way. It's an entertaining romp that culminates in a high-stakes encounter, and almost every main character gets some focus. I'll admit, though, I find the final conflict less interesting than the journey to get there, so 6 out of 10 stars for me, and a ranking in 20th place. We've reached a landmark with Nobita and the Spiral City from 1997, in which Nobita and his friends populate a planet with sentient toys. This is the last Doraemon movie that Fujio worked on before he passed away. In fact, he apparently collapsed while drawing the manga that this film was based on, and the rest of the story had to be completed by his company, Fujiko Pro. Without speculating on exactly how that affected this movie's development, I feel that Nobita and the Spiral City sets up multiple intriguing concepts, without really following up on them in a fulfilling way. Much of the story's resolution also seems to borrow heavily from beats that have already been seen in previous Doraemon films, so I give it a rating of 3 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 33rd place. But despite the death of its original creator, the Doraemon franchise continued producing movies, with Nobita's Great Adventure in the South Seas from 1998. Here, Nobita and his friends encounter pirates while searching for treasure in the Caribbean Sea. I have to say, we're off to a rough start after Fujio's passing. The story in this one is filled with coincidences and strange character decisions that happen for the sake of plot convenience. I'll give credit where it's due. I didn't get bored watching this movie, and every main character contributes at some point. It also features a few pretty cool-looking monsters. Nonetheless, it is probably still one of the more skippable Doraemon movies. 2 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in 41st place. The next movie is Nobita Drifts in the Universe from 1999. Giant and Suneo are accidentally abducted by aliens, so Nobita and the others travel through space to save them. This is basically Doraemon's attempt at a space opera. There have been so many space-themed Doraemon movies that I sometimes have trouble keeping them straight to my head, but to me Nobita Drifts in the Universe might be the most forgettable one out of all of them. It's not that it's too similar to other Doraemon movies, which I don't think it is, but there's just very little about it that I find exceptional. That's not for the lack of trying, though, because the last half hour or so is pretty much a rapid-fire series of plot twists and new developments. The problem is that these events happen so quickly that there's little room for them to make a real impression on the viewer. So I give this movie 3 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 35th place. We're in the 2000s now, with Nobita and the Legend of the Sun King. From what I remember, this was the first Doraemon movie I ever watched. In this one, Nobita switches lives with a Mesoamerican prince, who happens to look just like him. It's a pretty well-structured story, and the prince has one of the more compelling character arcs for a movie-exclusive Doraemon character, so I give it 7 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 13th place. And look, the next movie is about birds. In 2001's Nobita and the Winged Braves, Nobita and his friends stumble across a portal to a land inhabited by bird people. This is obviously a conceptually interesting movie to me, and has some exciting scenes to watch. However, I think the story feels quite unpolished, with some characters feeling more like plot devices than, well, actual characters. So this one gets 5 out of 10 from me, and a ranking in 21st place, just edging into the top half of my Doraemon movie ranking. After that, we got Nobita and the Robot Kingdom in 2002, in which Nobita and his friends rescue a lost robot boy who comes from a planet where humans and robots once lived in harmony, once being the key word there. I think this one gets very close to being a really good Doraemon movie. The emotional setup is strong, and there are some genuinely emotionally effective scenes, but it seriously drops the ball on a crucial character arc. The kicker is that the manga version of the story actually fixes my biggest problems with the movie, because this is a relatively recent Doraemon movie. I suspect that it's unlikely to get a remake anytime soon, but if it does, I'd love to see it incorporate more elements from the manga. If it followed the manga version more closely, this would probably rank as one of my favorite Doraemon movies, but as it is, I give it a 7 out of 10, and a ranking in 14th place, which is still pretty high. If you're wondering why there's a manga version of the story, even though Fujio had passed away by this point, the answer is that Fujiko Pro continued to produce manga counterparts to the movies for a while after his death. However, my understanding is that the manga and anime versions of these movies were developed in parallel from a shared story outline, instead of one being based on the other. Next, we have Nobita and the Windmasters from 2003. Here, Nobita keeps a small typhoon as a pet. Yep, for real. You'll have to watch a movie to find out what the deal with that is. The world building in this one is pretty fun, as the main setting is an isolated village, whose people have developed tools to harness wind energy for their daily needs, and the animals in the region have also evolved accordingly. It reminded me a lot of the element-based societies in Avatar: The Last Airbender, which this film predates. This movie is also infamous for its ending. Without giving away too much, I'll just say this is an emotional one. I give it 8 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 10th place. The final movie from the classic 1979 Doraemon anime came out in 2004, with Nobita and the Wan-Nyan Spacetime Odyssey. In this movie, Nobita does something about the local stray animal problem by sending abandoned dogs and cats back in time to a safe haven 300 million years ago in the Carboniferous period, which results in the stray animals starting their own civilization. If you're wondering about the title, Wang is a Japanese representation for the sound of a dog's bark, and Nyang is the same for a cat's meow. This film has many ingredients that could make a great Doraemon movie. There are time travel shenanigans, emotional connections between the protagonists and movie characters, and exciting action sequences. However, I think the execution leaves something to be desired in some places. It's still a fun movie to watch, but there are times when I feel the pacing moves too quickly, or the characters make strange decisions for the sake of plot convenience, so I give it 5 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 22nd place. For the first time, we have reached a break in the release of Doraemon movies. No new movie came out in 2005, probably because this was during the transition from the classic anime to the reboot series. The first movies we released following the reboot, in 2006 and 2007, were remakes of older Doraemon films, which I've already covered. So the first post-reboot movie, that was not a remake, was 2008's Nobita and the Green Giant Legend. In this one, Nobita brings home a young tree, but there isn't enough space for it in his family's yard. So Doraemon uses gadgets to give the tree the ability to walk and think. Most of this movie is quite a pleasant watch, the art is beautiful, and the interactions between the tree and the main characters are charming. But then the climax happens and everything flies off the rails. I'm trying to avoid spoiling things here, but even if I weren't, I would struggle to describe what goes on at the end of this movie. Suffice it to say, that this is almost certainly the most baffling Doraemon movie ever made. It reads as an attempt at making something artsy and profound, but then falling short. I give it 3 stars out of 10, and a ranking in 34th place. 2009's Doraemon movie was a remake of the records of Nobita's Spaceblazer, which I've already talked about. So the next in the lineup is Nobita's Great Battle of the Mermaid King from 2010. Here Nobita and Doraemon accidentally strand a mermaid princess in their yard. I remember this being the first Doraemon movie I saw that I actually thought was bad, and my opinion of it has not improved since then. This movie consists of logical inconsistencies, unsatisfying payoffs, and bizarre character decisions from start to finish. It gets 1 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in last place, making it my least favorite Doraemon movie. Now 2011 had the remake of Nobita and the Steel Troops, so we move ahead to 2012's Nobita and the Island of Miracles. Conceptually, this movie certainly piques my interest because it centers around Nobita and his friends traveling to a 22nd century island preserve for extinct animals. And quite a few remarkable extinct animals do feature in this movie. But the story here is so contrived and underdeveloped, I can't really recommend this film in good conscience. This one also gets 1 out of 10 stars from me and a ranking in 42nd place, second from the bottom of the list. Let's see if 2013 fares any better with Nobita's Secret Gadget Museum. In this one, Doraemon's bell that he usually wears around his collar gets stolen, and he really wants it back. So Nobita and his friends track it to a 22nd century gadget museum, where they have to figure out where the bell is and who took it. This is a very intriguing premise, because first of all, it's the first time they've done a detective story in a Doraemon film. In addition, the main setting, being a futuristic museum that displays the gadgets used by Doraemon, is a location that can pretty much only exist in the Doraemon universe. So right away, this is a movie with unique potential, and I'd say it does a respectable job, but I still came away from it slightly underwhelmed. I think there are a few reasons for that, though a pretty big one is that despite presenting an ideal setup for showcasing previously introduced gadgets in fresh and creative ways, much of the main plot hinges on new gadgets and additions to the lore. That being said, the movie doesn't skimp on cameos and references to established gadgets. All things considered, I put this one in the middle of the road, 5 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 24th place. Good idea, decent execution, but could have been more still. And now, we have something completely different. Stand By Me Doraemon from 2014. This movie is a separate production from the usual annual lineup of Doraemon movies. You might notice that it came out during the same year as a remake of Nobita and the Haunts of Evil. Instead of the usual 2D animated adventure story, Stand By Me Doraemon uses a 3D animated art style, and tries to weave a continuous narrative out of some of the most iconic stories from the Doraemon manga. For example, the plot of this movie takes inspiration from the manga chapters that show how Nobita and Doraemon met, and how Doraemon ends up changing Nobita's future. This is an incredibly popular Doraemon movie. It is the highest grossing film in the franchise to date, earning over $183 million at the box office. It and its sequel, which I'll talk about later, are also the only Doraemon movies currently available on American and British Netflix, and among the few to have received official English dubs. If you ask many Doraemon fans, it's likely that they'll name Stand By Me Doraemon as one of their favorites, if not their favorite overall. So this is likely to be my most unpopular Doraemon movie opinion. I am not a fan of this movie at all. To start off, I find the 3D character models somewhat uncanny. But that's really the least of its problems. I've seen worse, and Doraemon's gadgets actually look quite good in this art style. My biggest issues with this movie are with the story. I'm keeping things vague as to avoid spoilers here, but the fact that it tries to compress multiple manga stories into a single coherent narrative recontextualizes them in a way that really does not reflect well on several of the main characters, especially not Nobita and Doraemon, who you're supposed to be rooting for. It doesn't help that pretty much all the stories that Stand By Me Doraemon is based on have already been done justice by previous anime adaptations. If I want to watch an anime version of the story the night before Nobita's wedding, for example, I would much rather watch a 1999 short film version instead of Stand By Me's take on it. I'm fully expecting other viewers to disagree with me on this, but honestly, I think the main target audience of Stand By Me Doraemon is not hardcore Doraemon fans or people who are being introduced to Doraemon for the first time, but those who are nostalgic for the franchise and haven't revisited it in a while. It's a way for them to relive some of the most memorable Doraemon stories that they probably first experienced when they were little, packaged in a modern style of presentation. As far as I'm concerned though, this gets 2 out of 10 stars and ranking in 40th place. Moving on. Nobita's Space Heroes from 2015. Nobita and his friends film a superhero movie, but are then mistaken for actual superheroes. This is another Doraemon movie with a promising premise. After all, these characters have saved the world multiple times in previous movies, so giving them actual superpowers should make for a really fun story. In practice, the best thing I can say about this film is that it's a pretty good ensemble showcase, with every main character contributing substantially. However, the plot comes across as haphazard, with contrived coincidences, odd characterization, and lack of payoff to previous setup. So in the end, I don't rate this one very highly. 3 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 37th place. Skipping over 2016, because we already looked at the remake of Nobita and the Birth of Japan, we have 2017's Nobita's Great Adventure in the Antarctic, Kachi Kochi. Kachi Kochi is Japanese slang referring to something hard, like if it's frozen. In this movie, Nobita and Doraemon build an amusement park on an iceberg for their friends. but then discover a mysterious artifact from Antarctica that leads them on an adventure. I have mixed feelings about this one, because it does have its moments, it's visually very pretty, there's a time travel subplot that I think is quite well executed, and it has some fun references to Earth signs, such as Snowball Earth and the history of Antarctic glaciation. However, it makes some puzzling decisions in the use of its setting and its story, and most of the protagonists don't get a lot of characterization. So I give this one 5 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 25th place. Sailing onward into 2018 with Nobita's Treasure Island, here Nobita and his friends encounter pirates while searching for treasure out at sea. But this is not a remake of Nobita's Great Adventure in the South Seas, in which the same thing happens. In general, I think this is another Doraemon movie that is very nice to look at. There's some beautiful visuals, and the adventure is pretty enjoyable. However, one major problem I have with this movie is that about half of it is spent on a subplot that makes little sense, and ultimately doesn't serve much narrative purpose as far as I can see. Elaborating on that here would probably spoil it too much. I go into more detail in my text review, but in any case, I give this one 5 out of 10 stars, and a ranking in 23rd place. In 2019, we got Nobita's Chronicle of the Moon Exploration. The story here is that Doraemon helps Nobita create an alternate reality where rabbits live on the moon, inspired by various East Asian folktales. This movie, I think, does quite well at recapturing the vibe of a classic Doraemon film, in terms of how its plot is set up and unfolds. There are a few things here and there that I think are a bit silly, but it still gets 7 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in 15th place. We've made it to 2020 with Nobita's New Dinosaur. The premise of this one is like Nobita's Dinosaur, in that Nobita revives a fossilized egg, but this time it turns out to be a double-yolked egg that hatches into 2 feathered dinosaurs. The first half of this movie plays out pretty similarly to Nobita's Dinosaur, probably as an intentional homage, and I was worried that it would be too much of a retread of the same plot points. However, the second half goes off and does more of its own thing, and I quite like it. I also appreciate that this movie clearly took notes on the latest paleontological science and incorporated it into its story. No, not everything in here is scientifically accurate, and there is definitely some embellishment for the sake of entertainment. However, it's evident that the filmmakers went the extra mile in their background research. For example, the dinosaurs that we think almost certainly had feathers in this movie are all shown with feathers, and the end of the Cretaceous is said to be 66 million years ago and not the outdated 65 million years ago. There's a scene showing the footprints of a pterosaur, and they're obviously referenced from actual fossils of pterosaur tracks. That one really impressed me. So this one gets 8 out of 10 stars from me and a ranking in 11th place. 2020 had a second Doraemon movie, and that was Stand By Me Doraemon 2, which of course is the sequel to Stand By Me Doraemon. In this film, Nobita and Doraemon travel to the future to witness Nobita's future wedding, only to find that something has gone really wrong. I will say I like this one better than the first Stand By Me Doraemon. Its main story focus steers it away from the less tasteful elements of the first movie, and it also adapts fewer chapters from the manga, which gives it more room to put a fresh spin on things. I still don't consider this a great Doraemon movie, but it gets 4 out of 10 stars from me, and a ranking in 29th place. As mentioned previously, the Doraemon movie that was meant to be released in 2021 was pushed back to 2022 by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was a remake of Nobita's Little Star Wars, which I covered already. So that brings us to 2023 and Nobita's Sky Utopia, in which Nobita thinks life would be much better if he lived in a utopia, and asks Doraemon to help him find one in the sky. I think this one is a solid addition to the franchise, with a well-crafted and emotionally charged storyline, though it could probably be even better if it trimmed down some exposition and fleshed out certain story elements. I give it 8 out of 10 stars and a ranking in 12th place. And as of the time of recording, that's all the Doraemon movies, so if you followed this entire video up to this point, congratulations! It's striking to me that even after over 40 installments, there are very few Doraemon movies that I'd consider not worth watching. And not only that, but each cinematic storyline manages to do something that sets itself apart from the others. Considering how easy it would be for the nearly yearly releases of such a long-running popular franchise to descend into staleness and mediocrity, that is quite an achievement. And no, not every Doraemon movie is a winner, and I'm not going to claim that even my favorite movies in this franchise are the pinnacle of animated entertainment. However, if you like family-friendly science fiction about adventure and friendship, it's likely that you'll find something to enjoy about Doraemon. Not to mention, these films have played with such a wide variety of settings and genres that they can probably appeal to a broad range of personal preferences. There are good reasons, I think, why Doraemon is such a beloved and iconic franchise in so many parts of the world. So let's say you wanted to start watching the Doraemon movies, but you've never seen or read Doraemon before, at least not enough to be very familiar with it. And maybe you're not prepared to commit to watching all 40 plus movies from the very beginning. Which movie should you start with? The good news is that, with rare exceptions, most Doraemon movies don't contain plot-relevant references to events from the others, so they can generally be viewed in any order without missing much context. Now, the diversity of Doraemon stories mentioned previously means that opinions on individual movies will probably vary wildly from person to person. But on the off chance that you wanted to get my 2 cents on this, my recommendations for a first Doraemon movie would be one of these 3. Nobita and the Birth of Japan, the 2016 version, New Nobita's Great Demon, or Nobita's Little Star Wars 2021. As it happens, all of them are remakes of classic Doraemon movies, which was not a deliberate choice on my part, but in a way it makes sense. I think these movies combine the strengths of both the current and classic Doraemon series. My main reasons for recommending these 3 are that I expect their storylines to be relatively interesting to a wide audience, they don't require much prior knowledge of the franchise, they showcase the main characters and their dynamics with each other well, they give a good sense of what typical Doraemon movies are like, and I personally find them enjoyable, obviously. I also think that any of these 3 would be solid choices for someone's second or third Doraemon movie as well. Now, let's say you already know Doraemon, but haven't seen all the movies yet. Are there any specific ones I'd recommend then? My top suggestions, in that case, would be Nobita's Great Adventure into the Underworld, the 1984 version, Nobita and the Steel Troops, the 1986 version, and Nobita and the Kingdom of Clouds, if you haven't seen them already, of course. One final thing I'll mention before I sign off. As of the time recording, we already have the title and description of next year's Doraemon movie. It will be titled Nobita's Earth Symphony, and will explore the question of what if music disappeared from the world. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with this, because the Doraemon movies have never done a story with a musical theme before. They haven't run out of intriguing ideas for movie premises, that's for sure. Once again, if you're interested in my more detailed and spoiler-filled thoughts on any of the Doraemon movies released up to this point, I'll link my text reviews in the description below, and if you'd like to hear my friend Joan and I talk at length about not just our opinions on Nobita and the Birth of Japan 2016, but also the scientific basis for that movie, I'll be linking that video as well. And if you have any thoughts about the Doraemon movies, please feel free to share them in a comment below. I'd be really interested in what you have to say. So take care everybody, and thanks for watching.